Howdy everybody, and welcome to tonight's debate. Thank you all so much for coming out. Tonight we have members of Young Americans for Freedom and Texas Aggie Democrats here to discuss the topic of race in America. My name is Natasha. I am the president of Texas Aggie Democrats. I'm also one of the moderators tonight. Texas A&M Moderates. I'm the president of Texas A&M Moderates, and we are a discussion-focused political org, and we try to bring together students from all different viewpoints and basically just expose students to different beliefs other than the ones that they currently hold. And as such, we want to remind the audience to keep an open mind during today's debate and really consider the talking points of each organization. And with that, we'll have the Dems introduce themselves.
Howdy y'all, I am Kevin, the Vice President of Texas Aggie Democrats. I'm here with two of our members, Barrett and Zach. Our org, similar to Moderates, is a more discussion and voter registration based org. Obviously, most of us are Democrats in the org. And yeah, we are really glad that this was set up. We've been talking about it, I think, since like last semester and hoping this would happen. So first off, thank y'all for the Moderates for hosting this and to GAF for showing up. We're really glad to have y'all here. And yeah, I hope y'all can listen to us and maybe gain something, maybe disagree, maybe agree with us. Who knows?
My name is Carson Bethel.
Reagan Helsher. And my name is Rachel Sweeney, and I am the president of Young Americans for Freedom. We are a conservative, nonpartisan organization here on campus, and our goal is to promote conservative values through tabling initiatives, other initiatives on campus, and mainly bringing conservative speakers. We bring a large majority of conservative speakers here to campus and free events for people who agree or disagree to hear them and to explore ideas that they promote. Last semester we brought Ben Shapiro, we just brought Kellyanne Conway last week, we've brought Vice President Mike Pence, we've brought Matt Walsh, we've brought a bunch of different people, and our goal is again to just promote conservative values here on campus. We hold meetings bi-weekly on Thursdays. We finished our meetings for the semester, but we're really excited if any of y'all are interested to seek us out next semester.
Alrighty, thank you. So for the audience, I'm going to explain the format of the debate. Essentially, it's going to be an hour-long debate. I'm going to pose questions to both sides. I will be posing all questions to Dems, and Tasha will pose all questions to YAF. There will be a response or rebuttal. There could be a bunch of rebuttals. Basically, when we feel like gone too far off topic, we're going to step in and ask a different question. We ask the audience to be respectful, trying to cheer for either side. We don't want to ruin the structure of the debate. Essentially, just be respectful and hopefully have a good debate. Alrighty, so I'm going to start with the first question to Dems. And I'm going to ask, do you believe racism in America is systemic in nature?
Alright, so I'll be taking this question. And first and foremost, I'll say yes, I do believe, we believe racism in America is systemic in nature. And without getting too far into the details, because I think we'll go into that during the rebuttal period, the main reason we believe this is because if you look at the disparities between minority groups, especially Black Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans, and things like the unemployment rate, poverty rates, college education, stuff like that, there has to be some sort of explanatory variable for why they often have rates that are much lower than white Americans. And if you go into that, what is this explanatory variable going to be? Well, we know it probably is not random chance just because of how significant these differences are and the amount of them across various fields. And we see the same pattern of typically Black Americans and Hispanic Americans having rates much less than their white peers. So it's probably not random chance. The second possible explanation is an implicit reason, and we know it can't be this because this would be, having a pretty racist viewpoint, saying that there's something implicitly within each race that would make them better or worse in these various topics. So that gives you to your last possible explanation, which is an external reason, and this would be systemic racism. So systemic inequalities that have over time led to these disparities. So that would be my answer to that question.
All right, yeah.
Can you name some examples of what systems have caused these changes or these inequities?
I would be happy to do that. So I think first and foremost, I'm trying to not go too long, but slavery is a pretty big one, and not just the institution of slavery, but also the way it was ultimately ended and really how long that actually took. And I think a lot of things people don't really realize is that even after the passage of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, there were still instances of chattel slavery occurring in the United States well into almost the 1940s. And without going super into detail, because I know we don't have too much time, there were systems in the South put in place to restrict the rights of freedmen. And ultimately the main one that I'm getting at here is called debt peonage, which was this institution or this institutional system in which when you were charged with a crime, you would have to pay a certain fee to the state or to whomever you committed the crime against. And if you couldn't afford this, like many freedmen could not, freedmen referring to freed slaves, you would have to work off that debt. And you would essentially see a large proportion of the freedmen population going back into the same plantations, or even into like things like mining and other high laborious tasks like that, and essentially being put back into slavery despite slavery having been, abolished by the 13th Amendment. And you don't see this end until, like I said, I think 1942 is when the last chattel slave is freed in America. His name, I have it somewhere here. Scroll down. Alfred Irving. So I'd encourage y'all to look up his story. He was the last slave freed, I think, actually in Texas. And it wasn't, like I said, until the 1940s that the government kind of got around to reforming these debt peonage systems with Circular 3591. So that's just one example. And then beyond that, of course, we have Jim Crow laws, which was, large-scale segregation across the South, disparities in voting rights. Going into the more modern era, even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, you have stuff like redlining, which really affected how Black Americans especially could get housing. Things like that. There's still, gerrymandering is a pretty big issue, both partisan and even racial gerrymandering in the United States. There's plenty of different systems like that that continue to cause disparities, or were so recent that the effects of them are still being seen in our country today.
I would first like to acknowledge and agree with you that the government has created several institutions that hold people down, especially through slavery. And I think the main issue with that is tearing apart families. We're truly nothing without our family unit. That's what holds America together. And I think that the government has continued to break apart these minority families, and that's where we see a lot of these issues. They don't have the family structure to support them to go to college or to do amazing things in their lives. And a lot of people can overcome that, but some people can't. And I think that we need to really focus on creating that family structure and taking out government incentives for single mothers. Of course, we should support these single moms, but that needs to come from our community rather than our government, because a lot of people, unfortunately, will see this as a way to gain money for themselves and their children, but there are many people that use that money not to help their family. So we need to focus on incentivizing strong family units, and that will help ease racism tensions in America.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you on the, the important, or the effects on the family. That's definitely happened. Another big thing that I would point to as well is, and this isn't to like review or go at your point, just I want to add to this conversation, is the inability of familial wealth to be passed down, especially in a lot of minority communities. And the reason for this is, like I said, we talked about, like I mentioned, redlining. So one of the biggest ways for social stratification to occur, or rather for to move up in the social ladder, is through family wealth and the transfer of property, especially. And with a lot of these discriminatory practices, such as redlining, and then just historic inequalities, I think for example, in Oregon, and I think in a lot of Western states, they had bans on whether or not Black Americans could move there. It was only for white people to settle. And you see things like this. It just a lot of the racial inequalities also tied to economic disparity and stuff like that. And a lot of that, in my opinion, comes from this inability to pass down familial wealth, because, quite frankly, they don't have access to it soon enough, or at least not access to a high quality amount of it.
So would you disagree with it's kind of colloquially termed the death tax? So, like, for instance, if I had a wealthy family and then my parents died if I were to inherit their assets or monetary value, that then I would be taxed at a higher rate. Do you think that that could be holding back some minority families from continuing to grow their wealth?
Oh, I'm passing the mic. Sorry.
I don't think that's, I mean, I do agree that the, not good enough, sorry. I do agree that the death tax can be an issue, but I don't think that it is as big of an issue as a lot of people think it is, just because in a lot of instances the death tax is only applied to a high rate once you're already like fairly wealthy. So I know at least when my parents die, I'm not going to have to pay a death tax on their earnings because they don't make enough or have enough wealth built up that it's going to be an issue. And I know that a lot of minority families, especially the ones that have been affected by the lack of generational wealth in their families, have a lot less wealth than my family does. And I honestly don't think that it's that big of an issue in this instance. Of course, there are other, instances where it could be, but I don't think that it has anything to do with the generational wealth problem.
Do you feel that these entities, that governments kind of place a ceiling on a lot of different structures in our society, that kind of creates a feeling that these minority groups cannot break out of because they might be in like government housing or on food stamps or things like this, and they feel like an attachment to the government that then if they were to become successful, they wouldn't have this cushion to fall back on? Do you think that that prevents them a little bit from wanting to move forward in wealth?
So I don't think that it necessarily prevents them from wanting to move forward. I don't think it's necessarily an incentive for them to move forward. And I definitely think that our welfare system, Title VIII housing, something like that, it definitely needs to be reformed and looked at. I don't think it's the largest problem in America today. I think there are more pressing problems that we need to look at, but it ultimately is something that needs to be addressed. Now, the whole idea of people have this cushion to fall back on so that they're not going to want to progress in life. I think we need to start thinking about it differently. We shouldn't be thinking of it as a cushion. We should be thinking of it as a spring, and that may need a revision in the system itself. But if we consider this, government subsidized housing, food stamps, to be something that people just use instead of they try to build themselves up with it. We can't ultimately think that these people are ever going to get out of that hole, because if we keep keeping people on these food stamps and stuff, I think the point that I'm trying to get at, is that there has to be an incentive at the end of the road. That incentive may not be there right now, but ultimately, the food stamp program and government subsidized housing isn't the main problem. It is the generational wealth issue.
I'm going to allow you to have one more response. We're going to move on to the next question.
I would say that in terms of generational wealth, obviously when you're more rich, it's easier for you to do things, but I would say that there has been an issue with people building wealth, but I think it has been with the fact that the government has incentivized people to be okay with their position and to not want to move forward and build that wealth. And like Reagan said, there has been a safety net that has gone beyond safety. And it's allowed people to become comfortable and to incentivize family structures and behaviors that don't align with wealth building, and that has harmed a lot of people. It's caused a growth in our lower class, and it's sadly affected minorities harder than it has whites. And it's a really big issue, but we think that issue lies with over-governmental things that are supposed to make you rely on the government instead of relying on your community and your family. So.
This is for Young Americans for Freedom. Do you guys believe that racism is on the rise in America?
Surprisingly, yes. We identify racism as the prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. And by this definition, we think that it is on the rise. We don't see a lot of interracial violence like we used to see in the past, like we're not seeing large amounts of lynchings and things like that happened in the past. But a February 2023 Rasmussen report found that 53% of Black respondents agreed with the following statement: "It is okay to be white," meaning that 47% were unable to say that they agreed with the statement, "It's okay to be white." A little bit before that, there was a YouTube video by a place called Cut that asked Black people what are whites superior at? And they answered things like violence, oppression, stealing, not being able to cook, and these other derogatory claims. And so we think that there has been an increase in racism, but it's been against groups that are overrepresented according to the people who are in the media and things like that. And this really plays out in academia as well. There's currently a Supreme Court case where people for equal treatment are going up against the Harvard University because they believe that Harvard was discriminating against Asian American and white students in their applications to bring in more minority students, and discriminating because the Black students weren't getting the same SAT scores as Asian students. And this happens in the medical field, in directors' rooms and things like that. And it's really society saying that it's okay to discriminate against people who they believe are overrepresented in spaces for people who they believe are underrepresented.
And I'd like y'all to answer the same question. Do you believe racism is on the rise in America as well?
I'll answer that. I think it really depends on your definition of racism. I think if we're using the definition they gave, I would say personal racism, or the idea of like an individual having racist views. I don't think that's necessarily rising. I think it's probably about the same, if not less, than it was historically. If we talk about systemic racism and systemic inequalities, then I think for the most part it's probably also about the same, or maybe a little less, but still pretty prevalent. And then going into, I guess, kind of some of the points they brought up, and just kind of opening the discussion on that, the main thing I would kind of push back on, and I'm going to stay within the definition of racism that they used, just so we don't get into a debate about basically a debate about language and whatnot. I think that the examples that were given aren't necessarily indicative of a change in views or a rise in racism, as mostly because I don't think you can attribute. It's very difficult for me to kind of understand the idea of the white race simply because that definition has changed throughout our entire history. For a long time, you saw groups like Irish people and I think even Catholics to an extent were considered not white because they were just at the time being discriminated against, right? And so from the way I look at race especially, the idea of being white, simply white, and using terms like that are simply ways to distinguish between who is currently being oppressed and who isn't systemically. So for that reason, it's hard to me to argue that there's a rise in racism against white people, simply because I think that's like such a big group that it doesn't really connect in my brain, I guess. And again, without going into the debate over what racism, the definition of racism and whatnot, you certainly aren't seeing a systemic oppression of white people in America.
I guess it depends on what we determine to be systemic. I think it would be hard to say it's systemic because systemic racism is such a term that's really hard to define, and the definition is very mealy, and it changes. But hiring DEI administrators who their entire goal is to increase the diversity of people regardless of, of a lot of their scores, and it's really when you focus on the color of someone's skin, which determines the outcome and the makeup of whatever community you are. Make it academia, make it a corporate boardroom, make it even a hobby group. If you base something solely off of the color of someone's skin and you allow someone entrance into that organization or prevent them entrance from that organization, that is racism. And obviously it's not going to be the same violence-wise. I mean, people were literally enslaved back in the day. This is not the same thing as that, but it is behavior and thoughts that people have that does move in a scary direction.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause it right there since this leads right into our next question. So essentially for Dems, you can still respond to that, but do you believe that does choosing individuals based on DEI requirements as opposed to merit advertise a community to feel their race is more important than their qualifications?
I was just about to ask if you wanted to move to that question. There's a cute few parts to this, and I think something, Yaf gave a surprising answer on that. I guess at the start of that, they said you may not think we're going to say this, and I think you're not going to think that we're going to say this either. That the DEI, those measures that are in, are not perfect, right? If we really lived in a perfect world where everyone was equal from the start, everyone started at the same position, then we wouldn't need a lot of these things, right? We could clearly just have individuals, we believe they all started from the same position in life, and we evaluate them from there. But as we can see in the society today, median incomes of all demographics in America, they're very different, and people do not start at the same place. Asian Americans and white Americans have way higher median incomes than Hispanic and Black Americans. And another thing too, a lot of people believe that DEI is a very I guess maybe a Democratic, maybe a liberal position, and it's only from us, but Texas, if all of you went to I don't know if all of you went to high school in Texas, but the top 10% rule that you had to endure in high school is an example of this, right? The top 10% rule is there to increase diversity in colleges and to not overwhelm to give people that came from wealthier backgrounds an advantage. So I guess to sum it up a little, while these requirements and these measures are not, we probably would rather not have the top 10% rule in Texas. I think a lot of you probably felt that in high school, that you're pressured to get this higher GPA. But until we get a lot of these problems under control, the systemic inequalities and inequalities from birth, then these requirements are necessary and they need to be there.
So my question would be, which would be preferable, equity or equality? And then to follow that up, is it even realistic to is it realistic to achieve either of those?
I would, I guess my rebuttal to that is, do you think that the state right now is okay? If sorry, kind of screeching. If we got rid of those things today, do you think it would be truly fair to every single American, right from the start, right from applying to college? Do you think every American has a fair chance and they're equal to one another?
Well, I would say it's almost impossible I think it's impossible to enforce equity. I think it's also impossible to enforce equality. And even, a lot of people say equality of opportunity, but even then people are born into different circumstances. No one ever really has equality of opportunity. So I would say that shouldn't be necessarily something we should strive to do. We should not try to push for equality of opportunity, but we should push for merit-based rewards and incentives.
So I think on this issue especially, this is where it kind of comes down to whether or not it comes down to how influential you think systemic racism is on society today. So when we talk about things like, of course everyone would want the ideal society where everyone is treated equally from the start. There was no history of systemic inequality, and all of these merit-based things were truly just merit-based. But in a lot of cases, a lot of the things we consider to be merit-based, such as standardized testing, for example, just because we're talking about like college and SATs and whatnot. A lot of those things aren't necessarily just solely merit-based, right? If you look at SAT scores, a lot of the thing is not necessarily based on race determined score, right? It's a lot of the correlation is between income and because income and race and ethnicity are pretty closely tied, that's where you kind of see that disparity. I don't really like to use like personal anecdotes, right? But the SAT itself is a pretty imperfect test in that we kind of treat it as a gauge of not necessarily intelligence, but college aptitude, right? And because of the way we consider it to be that, I feel like we give it a little bit higher value than it should, because it's really a test that can be in a way gamed, right? You can study for the SAT if it was truly a test of how intelligent you are, like are you intelligent enough to go to college, then you probably shouldn't be able to study for it and improve your score, which there's businesses, I think like Khan Academy is a pretty good example of businesses that make a lot of their profit off of improving SAT scores, right? And where I'm getting at this is because of that, because of the role that wealth inequality, systemic racism can have on things like SAT scores and other merit-based tests, merit-based opportunities, it wouldn't be fair to essentially start everyone off from the same point, right? Because the reality is everyone is not starting from the same point. And that's why equity is a necessary thing we need to do until we can get reform these systemic inequalities and resolve them and get everyone back to that same point. So it's a temporary but necessary solution, in my opinion.
In response to your SAT topic, what I really think is interesting is that now, more than any other point in history, we have so much free information. So like Khan Academy, anyone can go watch those YouTube videos, they can go to their public libraries and study for this exam, which I feel like is less of an intelligence test and more of a, are you willing to put in the work to make it through college? Because, I think that we can all agree that not all the smartest people have A's in their classes, but the people that work the hardest for those classes have A's in those classes. And in extension to education, yes, there's a huge issue with low socioeconomic areas having low test scores, or even being with having zero capability to read and write. I think I saw one recently at like the 3rd grade level, and that's just terrible. We really do need to up our game with education, and I think the main way that we can do that is through school choice. These children in these low socioeconomic areas are being kept in schools that do not have the proper funding or the proper teachers to support their children and their education. So if we allow them to have some say in their education, they can choose to find a school that most suits them.
Okay, well, there's like a few points with this. So I like to use this, I guess it's somewhat of a personal anecdote, but like, with your first thing about Khan Academy, right? So whenever I was taking the SAT, ACT, right? And I used this I had the exact same debate with one of my friends about this. My mom, obviously wanted me to go to a good college, so she went and bought me like 8 books, right? In like all these online courses, which I did, right? I did all these courses, but I'd say like Khan Academy, obviously, I think it's a pretty much free course, but let's assume if we pay, if I pay for, I think it's Pearson, that's like the big one that you can pay for and get that course, I'm most likely going to be at an advantage compared to a student that couldn't, and compared to a student that the only resources they got is like the government, like the one they give you to prepare for the SAT. So like even with that, shouldn't we still have to invest in these communities? Like I'm going to work hard, but I have a clear advantage to someone, even if they're going to work just as hard as I do. I have a resource that they don't, so that's going to put me at an advantage, and it did. It's going to put me at an advantage to kids that don't have that resource. And I think you guys want, okay.
I do. So, to your point on school choice, so I come from an area that had a lot of kids that used school choice, and it wasn't the underprivileged kids that were using it. It was primarily white students that were trying to go to larger 6A high schools that had more, sports teams, better sports teams. Now, the other thing with school choice is, in order to adequately use school choice, families have to somehow get their child to that school. And school buses, which a lot of underprivileged students use, don't run to schools that are outside of that zone. So if you're using school choice, you have to drive your kid to school or have your kid drive themselves. And I know for a fact that that's not an option for a lot of underprivileged families. So it's I just don't think that it's right now being utilized in the way that it ideally would be. But you know, it's something that really isn't what it appears to be at face value. Yeah. Okay.
You good if we add something? Or you want to?
You can add something.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Yeah, just to go into school choice a little bit. So I actually went to a private school, which I know surprised, like the liberal went to a Catholic school, but so, and I was told like my entire life, you know, oh, you're going to a private school, this is going to get you a better education, this is going to get you, you know, so many more opportunities than if you went to a public school, because, you know, public schools are bad, right? That's essentially the arguments that my parents made. And one thing you realize if you look at like test scores, and again, test scores aren't always perfect, but we'll use them just because it's a good means of comparison. Private schools, and especially charter schools, do not do significantly better, or in some cases even better than public schools do. I know I'm sure that charter schools, particularly, I know that they historically have done actually worse than a lot of public schools, which is not ideal, because if a school fails, then you cannot, a school year is on a essentially year-long term, right? If a school was to fail, then that year's worth of education has to be essentially made up again, right? Because the students didn't get the proper access to that. And that's a long time, especially for a kid, especially in a society where we're encouraged to go to school for, what, a total of like 16 years-ish, if you go to college. Anyways, continuing on my point, the solution in my mind is not to push away from public schools, especially not with like things like school vouchers, which allow you to take like the taxpayer fund and put it to a school of your choice. Because what that ends up doing is just ultimately underfunding these already underfunded schools. The solution, in my opinion, is to fund these schools even more, these public schools, and help them out, especially in places like Texas, where I believe a lot of the school funding comes from property tax. So then if you go back into the issue of housing inequality, stuff of that nature, we're seeing systemic racism, right? Now because large groups of, we'll take an example, let's say a black community, right? They were redlined against. They were given, the only houses they could purchase or get loans from the bank was for a lower income housing area, stuff like that, right? So now their property tax is going to fund their school and their school district. Their property tax value is going to be less because they were only given access to this one particular area, right? So now that school district is underfunded. And that's what, to tie this all together, that's really what systemic racism is kind of all about. It's seeing this interconnectivity between race and so many different systems in our society, and how they interact with one another and unfortunately discriminate against a good chunk of the population. So
one more response.
I got a little off track there, but
one more response on this topic, and we're going to move on to the next question.
A lot of points there, but I'll try to address them as the order they came in. So in terms of the SAT prep, like Reagan said, there is a lot of prep that you can do and a lot of work that you can put in, but it really was the parents that put in the work for their child. You know, if you have to work some extra hours to be able to afford an SAT prep course for your kid, is that something that you're willing to do in order for them to succeed? And I think that it's important, you know, for parents to be present in their kids' lives and to care about their education. And a kid's not going to succeed in education if their parents aren't there to help them succeed, regardless of their race or their socioeconomic status. And I think we can all agree that education is what breaks down inequalities, especially in income and outcome. In terms of school choice. I think that if a school is not performing as it should, because there are schools, public schools, oftentimes in lower income neighborhoods that are not performing well. So why should the government keep funding them? Why should the government fund failure? If a company is not working, if a company is not getting good output, they shut down. So allowing kids to move to a school that works for them shows the government where is the success happening. And it doesn't have to be a charter school. It could be two public schools. Bringing my own personal example in, when I went to a public school, I moved schools within the same district and two public schools to go to a school that had a better program that better prepared me for college. And granted, I'll use this example, it was a program that was implemented in a lower income, more racially diverse school because they knew that that program had the chance to get kids re-engaged, to care about their education, and to educate them in a way that would make them better and prepared for college and for later success in life, even if that didn't include college. So schools should be allowed to see where is the money going. A kind of free market, even between public schools, kind of shows what is working, what is failing. And then a year of school failure is devastating. We saw this with COVID, that schools failed for a year because they shut down. We see the results to students with schools that the longer they were virtual learning, the less well they did on their math and their reading. But 1 year allows the school to see, okay, maybe we need to take what's working at this school and put it into this school that's not working, and maybe it's re-educating the teachers, it's other methods that work. But why would you keep allowing the school to fail without knowing what works and what doesn't for students based on where they're going and implementing those so you can have all of your public schools success and better compete with the private schools?
Alrighty, we're gonna move on to our next question now.
Okay, this is for Young Americans for Freedom. With the rise of casual racism on social media, are more young white men becoming accepting of casual racism in society?
As a young white man, I would say casual racism, I would say no, they're not becoming accepting of casual racism. I would say in general there is a lot of, lack of a better term, horseplay around the topic. Do I think any person believes anything that they hear anyone else say as a joke, or in some cases mean anything they're actually saying? I doubt it. I don't think it's a serious problem, but if it is, if you say you have a friend who is saying things that are racist, or you see someone online that you may know who's saying that, I think it should be addressed. Even if it's a joke in very poor taste, it should definitely be addressed.
I guess I'm just going to follow this up with a question before we start making any points. How do you think it should be addressed? Like through the government, through society, through what?
Definitely not addressed through the government at all. I think your community, your family, and your church are the most important things most important interactions a person has in their entire life, let alone on the day-to-day. I think the family should be very active in each other's lives, and their ideas they're sharing and ideas they're hearing, along with your church and definitely your community. Strength. Neighborhood barbecue in the backyard is, I'd say, one of the most important aspects of where you are, the relationship you have with the world, and how you perceive other people, such as minorities and things like that.
So can I ask another question?
Sure.
So what do you do when your community or your church or your neighborhood does not kind of put those ideas down, or are accepting of them, or simply are just oh whatever, or even promotes them? What do you do in that situation?
What do you do when your community promotes racist ideologies?
Yeah.
Well, you have a couple options. One option is you can try to rally around the other people in your community who agree with you and try to change your community, or you can leave.
And then what happens to that community?
Well, if enough people eventually, the competition of ideas, I think we can all agree that racism is an inherently flawed idea, in any context. So ultimately, bad ideas die, good ideas survive.
See, and this is, I guess, where we might diverge and we probably won't agree on is, unfortunately, if that idea were true, I think racism would probably already be dead, right? It's pretty much been something that's been around for most of human history. That's just an unfortunate reality. And I think at some point, if you, I guess, just try to attempt to let the culture, get rid of it, I don't think that will work. I think that's kind of just proven by history, in my opinion, and we might diverge in that viewpoint, but and I think that's when you do have to sometimes take actions, whether it be government action or something beyond that, into account. So.
Then I'd like Dems to answer that same question. How would you address racism in the community?
I'm going to answer all their questions, and there's no hard wait, did I actually? I can do it. No, you want it? Okay. It goes back to you.
So I think that is a concern. I think what you were getting at, though, is important, right? It should be something that is, condemned universally, right? And we would love to be at a point where everyone in human history or in the United States is just like, yeah, we're not doing that racism thing anymore, right? And I think really the main catalyst to fighting back against racism is actually education. And I do believe that the government should have a role in education, whether, mainly funding education in public schools, make sure everyone has equal access to quality education. So that's how I would say you combat racism in a community is it will take time, right? But you continue to educate, you dispel these racist views, explain to them, why this is not true. You have debates like this, right, where you discuss these ideas and get people thinking. And eventually you will be able to maybe not completely wipe out racism, right? But you'll at least create a society that better understands a wide range of ideas and is able to combat racist views, just through discussion. And eventually you'll see that probably not completely wiped out, but at least to the point where that's no longer socially acceptable.
So I would say that generally humans tend to make poor decisions. So I think that we all, as a community, need to come back to God, because God is not racist. So if we find a fundamental baseline within God, we will not have racism. And also furthering on your point with funding government education and that helping reduce racism in America, generally the government does a poor job at completing projects. Just a pretty general statement, takes a lot of money, takes a long time, and usually pretty poor outcomes. And we see this especially right now with critical race theory that's implemented in schools. I know a lot of schools say that they're not implementing this ideology, but I saw it happen in my high school towards my end of my high school career, and my mom as a public school teacher also saw it, especially because she was an English teacher. So she saw that as well within the literature that they were reading. And do you believe that critical race theory and teaching that in schools is creating a racist ideology within schools as funded by the government?
Okay, so I actually have a quick question for you before I answer that. So you said that your high school was teaching critical race theory. So you said you went to a public high school, correct?
All 12 years.
Excellent. So can you give me, in, I guess, as specific terms as you can, the definition of critical race theory and exactly what it is?
Yeah, I can pull that up.
Not from the internet. I'd like to know what you were taught in high school.
Well, it was kind of towards my senior year, and so we started implementing the UT on-ramps.
For UT.
UT.
Well, let's do it, guys.
And so I was not in that class, but I was in the AP class, so I didn't have to read those types of literatures that they were given, but they wrote a lot about gender ideology, which I feel like is not a very good use of our resources in education. I really enjoyed my AP literature classes, using rhetorical analysis and analyzing classic pieces of work, and I think that we really need to focus on that rather than focusing on abstract ideologies. If you want to do that in like an arts and humanities course, sure, by all means, go for it. but I don't really feel like that has a place in the English language arts classroom.
I would, I guess, like maybe not counter, but I took, what is it? It's like language and composition and literature.
Yes.
I don't remember the name, but I think I just know the one you take your junior year. I think it's language and composition, and I remember this because a lot of students in my school said, like, gosh, you're complaining about it, but a lot of the articles you read are about race, right? You know, it's a lot of literature from America, right? And you know, you have to do all this analysis on that stuff, but like my question to you, I guess, you know, that is very good literature, right? You know, you're forming your own opinion about it. You're doing, you know, some sort of analysis, usually like rhetorical, right? What would the like alternative be, right? You know, it's obviously, you know, that literature isn't in there to make students have a certain opinion or something. It's in there because it's literature.
Right, so I would agree with reading classic novels and articles about race in that instance, because I do think it's really important to read from historical references so that way we don't repeat ourselves. We never want to end up in a place where we're okay with things like Jim Crow law or slavery. We never want to do that again in America, of course. So I do think it's important that we read literature from that time, but what's happening now is students are being told that they're not like as valuable because they're a certain race, or they're kind of put down because of their race through the literature that's read in these classes. I think I more so experienced it just slightly in my UT On-Ramps American history class. We read a lot of Howard Zinn, who's a self-proclaimed socialist or communist. Do you all know? I think he was self-proclaimed socialist. It's been a long time since junior year of high school. But I honestly stopped reading the articles because it was just furthering putting down America. I think we need to read literature that uplifts America and does show the bad things that America has done, but shows how we overcome them rather than dividing us further through means of race. The idea of race stemmed from the scramble of Africa and kind of changing the way that we see different types of people. I really think it's interesting that typically the left really adheres to these ideas of different races. I really don't care at all what race someone is. I care about if they're willing to show up, how much work they're going to put in, and if they're going to put in valuable work. And I think that that's really what we need to come back to. And the CRT programs that are found, that are kind of ever being pushed into not only high schools, but in elementary schools as well, are further dividing America and not providing a strong baseline of education to our youth.
Zach has been begging for the mic, so I'm going to ask one quick question before I hand it to him. But the statement you made at the very, very beginning of that, which is that you believe these courses are teaching people that, you know, that they are like I don't know if it was less valuable, like because of their race, you know, like that I'm assuming you mean white people are being taught that it is an issue to be white. Do you believe that is what critical race theory is? And I'm going to let Zach get like before, unless we want to answer that.
Yeah.
Not entirely, but I think it's kind of a side effect.
All right, and then I'm going to give Dims the last rebuttal here, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go like too much into everything, but I think there's a lot of, first of all, I think the understanding of what critical race theory is kind of flawed, and I think a lot of that stems from just simplification for media coverage and whatnot and things like that. I don't think actual critical race theory is being taught in elementary schools or high schools for that matter, because it's a law theory, it's a law school topic that you might cover. If you are referring to critical race theory as just like the idea of like discussions about race, or you even mentioned like gender ideologies, I think was the term you used. I think that, you know, gives us the question of, okay, so what do we draw the line at? Because gender especially is a universal human experience, right? Even books like, you know, we talked about like classics. What's that book called? I'm blanking on the name. It's the I think it's in England, the group of girls, and one of them falls in love with the guy who's like kind of mean. I can't remember what the name is.
Wuthering Heights?
Pride
No.
and Prejudice?
Yes, Pride and Prejudice. Thank you. I knew someone would read my mind, right? That's a book not about LGBTQ people or anything like that. But it's about femininity, even to an extent masculinity, right? That's a discussion about gender. That's in a classic book, right? It's a universal human experience, and the same thing with how race has affected people is a human experience, right? There's plenty of Black authors that have written about their experiences, even as far back as the Civil War era, right? Frederick Douglass, even though he was writing not works of like fiction or anything like that, he was talking about he wrote about his own life, his own experiences with slavery and racial discrimination and whatnot. So I think if we go on this, I guess, tirade against gender ideology, as you put it, or just getting race out of the classroom, that kind of narrows down a lot of the books we're actually able to discuss or able to read, and the ideas that are able to circulate, right? So that's what I would comment on that.
Alrighty, so let's move on to the next question. And just a reminder, we only have 10 minutes left in the debate, so this might be one of the last questions. All right. So a common right-wing talking point is that of 1350, where African Americans, who make up 13% of the population, commit 50% of known crimes. In reference to this statistic, why do you think this disproportionality exists?
So I spent a lot of time looking for the source of this statistic, the 1350.
It's the FBI crime statistics.
Exactly, and so that's what I found. And the claim, I'm just going to reiterate it for everyone, it's that 13% of the population, the African American population, commits 50% of known crimes. And so I did what any good engineer or person that works with numbers would do, and I went and tried to find how that number was derived. And the best match that I could find for that statistic is that African Americans, who make up 13% of the population, make up 48% of arrests for known violent crimes. So I think there's a big difference between 50% of known crimes and arrests for violent crimes. So when I went and crunched the numbers myself, I found that if you include all crime, and this is of course arrests because they don't have data on convictions on that website, but it was closer to 17% of all known crimes. And I think that's a pretty big disparity between the 50% and 17%. And I have a lot more here, but I'd like to open myself up for questions, I guess.
Yeah, I think we can kind of take it away from the statistics just in general and honestly not entirely even focus on race as the issue, but just lowering crime in general. We don't want violent crimes in our communities, and the issue derives from divorce. If you live in a single parent or single mom household, you are significantly more likely to end up being arrested at some point. This is not the case when a dad is the single parent. I think dads probably set stricter parameters than moms. Women are a little bit more emotional, of course, because of all of our hormones and whatnot, but dads that are single parents do not create the same criminal output that single parents that are moms are. So I think that's really what we need to address, and I do believe this is definitely from systemic government involvement within minority communities, especially Black communities, and incentivizing single-parent households, like I had mentioned earlier.
How does the government incentivize single-parent households?
By incentivizing single mothers.
How do we incentivize single mothers?
Because on the welfare system, you get more money for your household if you're not married. Like, you get more money per person.
So for every child that you have, you're going to get more money if you're a single parent.
Sorry.
So what would your solution to that be? Would that be to remove that requirement? Because I think the reason that's there is because you would only have a single parent. You have, we'll just be generous and say you have half as much income as a two-parent household, right? So I think that would be the reason that's in place, right? Or do y'all think there's, what's the solution to that? If we want to disincentivize single motherhood, what do we do in regards to what y'all mentioned, the extra payments?
remove no-fault divorce, and get rid of the hookup culture that we have parading about our society.
In addition to incentivizing staying married and having more kids.
Like the earned income, income tax credit, and other like bills that are being proposed by lawmakers, which gives you increased tax breaks, including one that's proposed here in Texas that says if you're married, you can have a tax break, and then for every kid you have, it increases the amount of taxable income you can decrease and pay less taxes for.
There's a few things here, I guess. Sorry, there was like, I went off on a little bit. I guess I'm going to ask another question before I guess we get a rebuttal. What does increasing the amount of kids that a family has, what does that have to do with what we just talked about? Like, I know it's incentivizing marriage is, a good thing, giving couples a reason to get married and stay married, right? But, we have these measures in for, single mothers especially. It's going to be harder for a lot of single mothers to get a job and support their family, and removing those measures would be pretty drastic. It's already not a great situation to be a single mother and to have any kids, for that matter. So, why would we, get rid of those measures, first off? And two, what is incentivizing having kids?
So I would like to address your comment on taking away money from these single mothers. We should support them from our community. It should not be a government-based issue. So I think it kind of stems from my religion. Because I'm Catholic, I do believe in charity from our communities. So I think that's a huge sentiment within religion that we should definitely support. And then incentivizing more children. The more children that you have, the stronger your familial bond is, and kids can help each other. So I know growing up, although it didn't always work, my brother would help me with math a lot. He's more math-brained, I'm more English-brained, but that I did have that support. So that did make my life easier in some instances, and I would imagine it would be easier if I had even more siblings and people to help out around the house, and just in general create a stronger family bond and more support from the parents.
All right. I feel like y'all might know what I'm already going to ask. So what do you do when the community will not just support these single mothers, right? That would be my first question. And number two, what about situations, we talked about divorce and keeping families together. What about situations where the father is deceased, or perhaps he's in prison, right? Or another example like that, right? Where it's not divorce that is the reason for these single mother households. It's like I said, death of the father, or maybe he's in prison, stuff like that. What do you do? How do you square the two? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think that also stems from community support, branching out from your family. So if you are involved in your community, you're of course going to have strong community support. It was very commonplace, I feel like, before the 2000s, if someone died in a family, and maybe some of y'all still do this as well, but if someone dies, then people bring tons of food to help provide for that family during that time of mourning, and to relieve a lot of stress that they may have. And communities do step up. Very rarely do you see communities that just do not support each other, and I do think that that is becoming more present with lack of religion and more urbanization. With urbanization, we see a lot of kind of people being more individualistic and not caring about the community, and like corporate rat race, of course. And I get it, I want to be successful too, but we have to have more empathy for our community members and volunteer and donate and all of those amazing aspects of community.
And this is going to be the last response to the debate right here, because we are almost out of time.
Oh wait, I don't ask any questions. Well, I guess with that is, there's a little bit of an underlying thing that Zach kind of pointed out. It says what if that community doesn't support the people, and I think a great point with that is, what if they don't have the resources to support that people? There are poor neighborhoods, there's a lot of poor neighborhoods, there's poor communities, and a lot of those people are not going to have the resources to support someone that's going through something, right? And by resources, I mean a lot of it is financial resources, right? That community does not have a lot to share. They may want to volunteer, they may want to help out, and even though they're going to help out as much as they can, but ultimately, without supporting someone financially, without supporting a single parent financially, without the government having something there to support that family or that parent, what is the solution if the community doesn't help out? Can we really tell people to just go depend on their neighbors, when they have something like that when they have a crisis? Or should we have something there that is in place whenever they do go through something like that?
All right, we're going to have to call it there. It is now time to end the debate. Please give a round of applause to both of these guys. We know these are some hot button topics, so thank both of y'all for coming out here, and thank to the audience for coming out here as well. Have a nice day, everybody.
Yeah.